The moment Oliver Wallace rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the late spring of 1878, a gunshot rang out from the far end of Front Street, and every soul on that dusty strip of civilization either dove for cover or pressed themselves flat against the nearest wall. Every soul, except for one woman who stepped directly into the middle of the road and stared down the shooter with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst the world can offer. Oliver pulled his horse to a sharp halt, the animal snorting and stamping, and he watched from beneath the brim of his weathered hat as the woman stood her ground while a wild-eyed man with a pistol waved it in the direction of the general store behind her. The shooter was drunk or mad or both, and he was screaming something about money owed, but the woman, dark-haired, straight-backed, wearing a faded blue dress and a canvas apron, simply folded her arms across her chest and told the man in a voice that carried all the way down the street that if he did not lower that weapon in the next 10 seconds, she would have Sheriff Dawes lock him in a cell so small he would not be able to bend his knees until autumn. Whether it was the steadiness in her voice or the appearance of a deputy rounding the far corner at a jog, the drunk man lowered his pistol and sat down in the dirt and began to weep. The woman uncrossed her arms, walked over to him, said something quiet that Oliver could not hear, and helped the man to his feet. She handed him off to the deputy with a few words and then turned back toward the store as though nothing more significant than a brief interruption had occurred. Oliver sat on his horse and felt something shift inside his chest that he had no immediate name for. He had not come to Caldwell looking for anything except his brother. Daniel Wallace had written him a letter 4 months ago from this very town, telling Oliver that he had found work on a cattle drive heading north along the Kishom Trail, and that when the drive was finished, he would have enough money saved to buy a small parcel of land somewhere in the territory. After that letter there had been nothing. Not a word, not a line. Oliver had waited as long as a man of his particular disposition could wait, which was not long at all, and then he had saddled his horse in St. Louis, told his employer at the freight company where he could put the job, and ridden west and south for 3 weeks through rain and mud, and one genuinely terrible river crossing that he preferred not to think about. He had a description and a name and the last known town, which was Caldwell, and now he had arrived in that town, and the first thing he had seen was a woman who apparently believed she was bulletproof. He tied his horse at the post outside an establishment bearing a hand-painted sign that read Harper's Dry Goods and Feed, and he pushed through the door into the cool, dim interior where the smell of coffee and leather and dried herbs hit him like a welcome embrace. The store was orderly in a way that spoke of someone who cared deeply about the arrangement of things. Barrels of flour and cornmeal stood in a row along the left wall. Shelves behind the counter held spools of thread, tins of tobacco, small bottles of patent medicine, bolts of calico and muslin. A glass case near the window displayed a collection of knives and a few small tools. The whole place had the feeling of something tended carefully, the way a garden is tended by someone who understands that neglect is a kind of violence. The woman he had watched in the street was standing behind the counter, writing something in a ledger. She did not look up immediately when he entered, which told him she was either extremely focused or she had very good peripheral vision, and had already decided he was not an immediate concern. "I will be right with you," she said, finishing her line of writing before she set down the pen and looked up. She was younger than he had initially guessed from a distance, somewhere around 24 or 25, with dark eyes that were quick and assessing in the way of someone accustomed to sizing up strangers on a daily basis. There was a small scar along her jaw that she made no effort to hide, and her hands, when she closed the ledger, were the hands of someone who worked hard and did not apologize for it. "You are new," she said. It was not a question. "Just rode in," Oliver confirmed. He pulled off his hat and held it in front of him. He was 29 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been described by his mother as honest and by at least 2 trail bosses as stubborn, and he reckoned both assessments were accurate. "I am looking for someone. My brother. His name is Daniel Wallace. He would have come through here sometime in the fall or early winter of last year, most likely with a cattle outfit." The woman's expression shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Something careful moved behind her eyes, and she took a breath that was slightly longer than a normal breath. "My name is Ellen Harper," she said. "I own this store, and yes, I knew your brother." The word "knew" landed on Oliver like a stone dropped from height. "Knew," he repeated. Ellen Harper looked at him steadily, and he could see that she was the kind of person who did not soften difficult things past the point of honesty. "Your brother worked for me for about 6 weeks last autumn. He helped me with deliveries and repairs after the man I had hired before him left for the Colorado silver fields. He was a good worker and a genuinely kind young man." She paused. "He passed away in December. There was a fever that moved through the town. He was not the only one it took." Oliver stood very still for a moment. The hat in his hands felt suddenly heavy. He had known, somewhere in the deep and practical part of himself, that the silence from Daniel meant something bad, because Daniel was not the kind of man who simply forgot to write. He had known it and had been riding toward the knowing all these weeks, and now here it was, delivered by a stranger with dark eyes in a dry goods store in a cattle town on the Kansas border. "Where is he buried?" Oliver asked, because that was the question his voice found first. "The cemetery is at the north end of town, past the Methodist church. I can walk you there if you would like. I close the store at midday on Thursdays for an hour." She glanced at the small clock on the shelf behind her. "It is Thursday. I have about 20 minutes. He did not know what he had expected, but it was not this kind of practical, unhurried offer of help. He said yes. He did not know what else to say. He spent those 20 minutes looking around the store in a directionless way while Ellen Harper finished her entries in the ledger, wrapped a parcel for a woman who came in with 2 small children tugging at her skirts, and exchanged a brief conversation in Spanish with an older man who purchased rope and a tin of lard. Oliver watched her move through these small transactions with efficiency and genuine warmth, and he thought that his brother, who had always been drawn to capable and straightforward people, would have liked working here very much. When she was ready, she untied her apron, hung it on a peg behind the counter, and put a small hand-written sign in the window that read "back in 1 hour." She came around the counter and he held the door for her, and they walked out into the bright afternoon together. Caldwell was a busy town. It sat just above the Kansas-Indian Territory line, and served as one of the main shipping points for the Texas cattle trade, which meant it had all the energy and noise and occasional danger of a place where a great deal of money changed hands between people who had very different ideas about how that process should go. There were saloons and a hotel and a bank and several churches, a weekly newspaper office, a barbershop, a doctor's office, and enough horses tied to enough posts that the entire street smelled unmistakably of the frontier economy in full operation. Ellen walked at a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be and knew exactly how to get there, and Oliver fell into step beside her. They did not talk much on the walk north, which he appreciated. He was still carrying the news about Daniel, turning it over in his mind with the slow and careful movements of a man handling something fragile. The cemetery was a well-kept piece of ground surrounded by a low wooden fence. Ellen pushed through the gate and led him along a path between the markers until she stopped at a simple wooden cross with Daniel's name carved into it, along with the year. Someone had planted a small clump of prairie flowers at the base of the cross, and they were just beginning to bloom. "I had the cross made," Ellen said quietly. "He did not have anyone here. I wanted there to be a marker." Oliver crouched down and put his hand on the cross and stayed like that for a long moment. The wind moved across the grass and the flowers nodded, and he let the grief come through him in the way grief needs to come, not rushed, not swallowed, just present. When he stood again, he found Ellen a few steps away, giving him the privacy of distance without actually leaving, and he was grateful for that particular understanding of what a person needs. "Thank you for this," he said. "For the marker, for bringing me here." "He talked about you," she said. "He said you were the most bull-headed person he had ever known and also the most reliable, and that those two things were probably connected." Oliver let out a breath that was half laugh and half something more painful. "That sounds right." They walked back to the store in slightly more silence than they had walked north, which was a different kind of silence, the kind that has been earned rather than assumed. At the door of Harper's Dry Goods, Oliver put his hat back on and looked at this woman who had known his brother and marked his grave and planted flowers at his cross, and he said, "I am going to be in town for a while. I need to collect his belongings if there are any and send word home. Is there a decent boarding house?" "Mrs. Calloway's, 2 blocks east," Ellen said. "She runs a clean establishment and the meals are reasonable. Tell her I sent you and she will give you the room with the east window. It gets the morning light." He thanked her again and she went inside and the door swung closed behind her, and Oliver Wallace stood on the boardwalk of a cattle town in Kansas in the spring of 1878 with his brother in the ground and a woman on his mind, and a feeling he could not yet interpret pressing with considerable insistence against the inside of his ribs. He found Mrs. Calloway's boarding house easily enough, and the landlady, a round and efficiently cheerful woman of about 50, did indeed give him the east room when he mentioned Ellen's name. The room was small and clean with a braided rag rug on the floor and a good mattress and the promised east window, and Oliver sat on the edge of the bed for a while staring at the floor, and then he got up and washed his face and went to find the small collection of Daniel's possessions that Mrs. Calloway had been keeping in a box in the storage room. The box contained a folding knife, a spare shirt, a small Bible with their mother's handwriting on the inside cover, 3 letters that Oliver had written to Daniel and which Daniel had kept, and a photograph of the two of them taken in St. Louis 5 years earlier. Oliver sat with these things for a long time. The next morning he went back to Harper's Dry Goods, not with any particular plan, but because it was the only place in this town that felt even slightly known to him. Ellen was already open and working, carrying a crate of canned goods from the back room to the shelves with the methodical efficiency of someone who has performed this task many times. "Can I help with that?" Oliver asked. She looked at him briefly. "The ones in the back room go on the left side of the second shelf. The labels face out." He went to the back room and carried crates, and she directed him without ceremony, and they worked in companionable silence for about an hour, and at the end of that hour she made 2 cups of coffee on the small cast-iron stove in the back and handed him one and said, "You have no reason to stay in Caldwell now." It was not unkindly said. It was simply an observation, offered the way she seemed to offer most things, directly and without decoration. "No," he agreed. "No particular reason." "But you are staying. For a while." She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him with the assessing gaze that he was beginning to understand was simply the way she looked at everything. "Why?" He considered the question honestly, which was his habit, even when the honest answer was inconvenient. "Because I have not figured out what I am going back to yet," he said, "and because being here feels less wrong than anywhere else right now." She nodded slowly. She did not push further, which he appreciated, and she did not offer any false comfort about the way grief rearranges a person's sense of direction, which he appreciated even more. "I could use help," she said after a moment. "I have a delivery route that runs out to 3 homesteads east of town, and I have been doing it alone since my last employee left. It requires a wagon and a horse and someone who can lift things and does not complain much. It pays modest wages and includes the noon meal." Oliver looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "You are offering me a job." "I am offering you something to do," she said, and there was a slight dry quality to her voice that he suspected passed for humor in her particular register. "Whether it qualifies as a job depends on how useful you turn out to be." He said yes. He did not know what else to say. which was becoming something of a pattern where this woman was concerned. The delivery route turned out to be 20 miles of rough track east of Caldwell, serving 3 farm families who could not easily get to town and who depended on Harper's for everything from flour and seed corn to needles and lamp oil. Oliver drove the wagon and Ellen rode beside him and read from the order list, and they developed, over the first few trips, a working rhythm that was easy and unforced. He learned things about her in the gradual way you learn things about someone when you are working alongside them. She had come to Caldwell 3 years earlier with her husband, Thomas Harper, who had purchased the store from a man retiring to Missouri. Thomas had died of a riding accident 14 months later, leaving Ellen with the store and a modest debt, and the choice of either selling and returning to her family in Ohio or staying and making something of what she had. She had stayed. She had paid off the debt within 8 months through the kind of disciplined and intelligent management of the business that Oliver found genuinely impressive. She had no family in Caldwell. She had the store and a small house behind it, and a garden that she tended on Sunday mornings, and a small gray cat named Almanac who lived in the back room and had strong opinions about where the crates were stacked. She told him these things not in one conversation but in fragments across many days, offered as context when it was relevant, never as complaint or appeal for sympathy. She was 25 years old and she had already endured more than her share of loss, and she carried it the way strong people carry hard things, not pretending it was light but not letting it bend her double either. Oliver, for his part, told her about growing up in Indiana with Daniel, about their father's small farm and their mother who read everything she could get her hands on and insisted both her sons do the same, about the freight company in St. Louis and the years of practical rootless work that had suited him right up until they did not. He told her about Daniel being 4 years younger and endlessly optimistic in the way of people who have not yet had enough of life's contrary opinions delivered directly to them, and she listened the way she did everything, with full attention and without unnecessary interruption. They argued sometimes. Ellen had opinions about the arrangement of the wagon load and the best order to visit the homesteads and the correct way to keep the account ledger, and she expressed those opinions without apology. Oliver had his own ideas about efficiency, and he expressed those equally directly. They disagreed about 3 things in the first week, reached reasonable compromises on all 3, and discovered in the process that arguing with someone who is both intelligent and fair is considerably more satisfying than arguing with someone who is only one of those things. On the second week of deliveries, they drove out to the furthest homestead, which belonged to a family named Hendricks, and found the wife in considerable distress, because a section of the roof had collapsed overnight in a wind storm, and the interior of the house was open to the sky, and the husband was away in Wichita collecting a parcel of horses he had purchased. Ellen was out of the wagon before it had fully stopped. She assessed the damage in about 30 seconds, told Mrs. Hendricks what materials would be needed, and turned to Oliver with a look that said she expected him to agree with her assessment and get to work. He agreed with her assessment. They spent the afternoon on and around that roof, Oliver doing the physical work of pulling the damaged timber while Ellen directed from below, and kept the 3 Hendricks children occupied and out of the way, and managed to make the whole thing seem less catastrophic than it was. By the time they drove back to town in the long summer evening light, the roof was stable enough to keep the weather out until Mr. Hendricks returned. Oliver was quiet for a good part of that drive, watching the prairie go gold and rose in the evening, and listening to the steady sound of the horse and the creak of the wagon, and he was thinking about how she had moved through that afternoon without a single wasted motion or word, and how the Hendricks children had trusted her immediately the way children trust people who are genuinely paying attention, and how she had looked at him across the wreckage of that roof with an expression that was equal parts competence and care, and he thought that whatever was pressing against the inside of his ribs these weeks was becoming easier to name. He did not name it yet. He was a careful man. They ate supper that evening at the small table in the back room of the store, which had become a habit by the third week without either of them explicitly proposing it. Ellen cooked simply and well beans and salt pork and cornbread, coffee, sometimes a dried apple pie on days when she had the time, and Oliver had taken to contributing by picking up whatever seemed useful from the market down the street. The cat almanac occupied the third chair at the table with the air of a permanent fixture, which he supposed the animal was. "You are good at this kind of work," Ellen said that evening, referring, he understood, to the roof repair and the general usefulness of the afternoon. "Is this what you did before the freight company?" "My father's farm," he said, "and before that my grandfather's. There was always something that needed fixing." "What did you actually want to do?" she asked, "when you were young enough to want things before practicality took over?" The question was perceptive enough that it caught him slightly off guard, which did not happen often. He thought about it genuinely rather than producing a ready answer. "I wanted to go somewhere that was still being made," he said finally. "Not finished country, country where things were still being decided." Ellen looked at him for a moment. "You are sitting in it," she said. "I know," he said, and he held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and something moved in the air between them that was warmer and more deliberate than the air between two people who are simply sharing a meal and discussing practical history. Ellen looked down at her coffee cup. Oliver looked back at his cornbread. Almanac pushed his nose against the edge of the table and was ignored. Caldwell in the summer of 1878 was the kind of town that generated stories at a reliable rate. The cattle drives were coming through on the Kishom Trail, and the drovers, many of them young men from Texas who had spent weeks in the saddle eating dust and earning $30 a month, arrived in town looking for exactly the kind of recreation that $30 a month could fund. The saloons along Front Street were busy, the hotel was often full, and the general mood of the place was a particular cocktail of commerce and restlessness that kept Sheriff Dawes and his two deputies working long hours. Oliver was in the store one afternoon when a group of trail hands came through the door, not in any threatening way, just young men wanting supplies, loud and cheerful in the way of people who have been isolated for a long time and are suddenly back in the company of civilization. They bantered with Ellen across the counter, complimentary in the easy and slightly performative way of men who spend most of their time around other men, and she handled it with the smooth and practiced confidence of someone who had been dealing with this particular variety of customer for 3 years without incident. Oliver watched her from where he was restocking the hardware section and noticed that she was entirely in command of the situation, charming without being inviting, efficient without being cold, and that there was a quality to the way she managed the room that was very specifically the quality of someone who has learned exactly how much of themselves to offer in a professional context and holds the rest in careful reserve. He also noticed, with somewhat more personal interest, that she did not look at any of those young trail hands the way she had looked at him across the roof repair job, or in those moments over supper when the conversation turned real. That observation pleased him more than he thought it was advisable to admit, even to himself. The event that shifted everything happened on a Friday afternoon in July, which was hot enough that the air above the street shimmered and Almanac had taken up residence in the coolest corner of the storage room and refused to be moved for any reason. Oliver was fixing a broken hinge on the back door of the store when a rider came down the alley at speed and pulled up in a spray of dust and told him that there had been trouble at the Hendricks place and that Mrs. Hendricks was asking for Mrs. Harper specifically, and could someone go out there quickly. He went inside and found Ellen and told her, and she was already taking off her apron before he finished the sentence. They took the wagon at a pace the horse made clear it considered unreasonable. On the road, Ellen told him what she knew about the situation at the Hendricks homestead, which was that Mr. Hendricks, who had returned from Wichita in high spirits with his new horses and a notable quantity of whiskey, had been in a deteriorating argument with his wife about money that had apparently been ongoing for some time, and that the situation had reached a point where Mrs. Hendricks felt she needed someone in her corner. "Is she safe?" Oliver asked directly. "She was when the rider left," Ellen said. "But I want to get there." They got there. Mr. Hendricks was in the yard, not violent but agitated, in the way of a man who had drunk enough to lose his judgment without losing his stubbornness. Mrs. Hendricks was in the doorway of the house with all 3 children behind her, and the expression on her face when she saw the wagon coming down the track was the expression of someone who has been waiting for reinforcements and is enormously relieved to see them. Ellen climbed down from the wagon and walked directly to Mrs. Hendricks and put an arm around the woman and spoke quietly to her. Oliver stayed near the wagon and kept his eyes on Mr. Hendricks in a way that was steady and not aggressive, but made it entirely clear that there was a second person present who was paying attention. Mr. Hendricks looked at Oliver, and then at his wife with Ellen beside her, and then at the ground, and something in the mechanics of the situation, the presence of witnesses, the returning sobriety of consequence, shifted his posture from agitation toward something more like shame. Ellen spent an hour at that house. She talked to both of them, separately and then together, with the particular skill of someone who understands that people in crisis need to be heard before they can be reasoned with. She made no dramatic speeches and cast no judgments in loud voices, but by the time she was done, Mrs. Hendricks had a small amount of money set aside in a place only she knew about. The children had been settled and calmed, and Mr. Hendricks had agreed to speak with the Methodist minister about the drinking. On the drive back to Caldwell in the last golden hour before sunset, Oliver held the reins and let the silence rest for a while before he said, "You have done that before." "Yes," Ellen said simply. "It is a skill," he said, meaning it genuinely. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that was slightly more open than usual, as though the day had worn down some of the careful reserve she carried. "It is something my mother taught me," she said. "She used to say that most trouble between people comes from not being heard. She said if you can make a person feel heard, they can usually find their own way to what is right." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Oliver said. "She was," Ellen said, and the past tense carried all the information he needed without requiring further elaboration. They were quiet again for a while. The prairie around them was that particular shade of late evening that makes even flat country look like a painting, all depth and gold and long violet shadow, and the horse moved at an easy walk and the wagon creaked in a rhythmic and comfortable way. "I want to tell you something," Oliver said, because the day had been the kind of day that makes directness feel necessary. "All right," Ellen said. "I came here looking for my brother and I found him, in the worst way a person can find someone they were hoping to find." He paused, organizing his words. "But I also found this place, and I found this work, and I found you, in the way that you know a person when you have been alongside them in enough situations that you understand what they are made of." He looked at the road ahead rather than at her. "And I have been thinking for some weeks now that I do not want to leave, and that the reason I do not want to leave is not only the place but specifically you. And I thought I should say that plainly because I am not a man who is comfortable with implications." The silence after this was several seconds long. Oliver kept his eyes on the road. "That is a plain way of saying it," Ellen said. "Yes." Another few seconds. The horse walked. The wagon creaked. "I am not comfortable with implications either," Ellen said. "So I will say plainly that I have noticed you, Oliver Wallace, and that I have been glad you stayed, and that I think I would not be glad in the same way if any other person had been in your place." She paused. "That is as much as I am able to say right now." "It is enough," he said. He meant it. She nodded once, and something settled between them that felt like the closing of a door on uncertainty and the opening of one on something that had not yet been named, but was clearly present, and had been present for some time and was patient enough to wait to be handled properly. That was a Friday. On Saturday, Oliver bought new boots because his old ones had finally given up in the way of things that have been used honestly past their natural life, and he thought about what Ellen had said, and he was careful and deliberate because those were the qualities he had, and he applied them here as he applied them everywhere. On Sunday morning, he went to the Methodist church, partly because it was the decent thing to do in a new community, and partly because he knew Ellen went every Sunday. She was already in a pew near the back when he arrived, and he sat beside her without asking, and she moved slightly to give him room without being asked. And those two small cooperative gestures said more between them than the entire deliberately careful conversation on the wagon had managed. The minister was a tall man named Reverend Holt, with a dry sense of humor that surfaced occasionally in his sermons in ways that surprised you just as you were settling into something solemn, and Oliver found himself more engaged than he had anticipated. After the service, he and Ellen walked through the churchyard and talked about nothing particularly significant: the weather, the likelihood of a good corn harvest, whether the hotel at the end of Front Street was going to be bought by the railroad company as the rumor suggested, and it was the most comfortable conversation Oliver had had in years. He thought about Ellen a great deal over the following days. He thought about her practicality and her kindness, and the way she was both of those things at once, without either one diminishing the other. He thought about the scar on her jaw and how he did not know where it came from and wanted to. He thought about her hands and the way she held a coffee cup and the specific quality of her attention when he was talking, which was the quality of someone who was actually listening and not just waiting for their turn to speak. He thought about the fact that she had already endured losses that would have sent other people running, and that she had not run, and what that said about the nature of the person doing the staying. He thought about Daniel, too. He thought about Daniel a great deal. He wrote a long letter to his mother in Indiana, telling her what had happened, where Daniel was buried, what his last months had looked like based on what Ellen and Mrs. Calloway and one or two others in town had been able to tell him. He tried to write the letter in a way that was honest but not brutal, that gave his mother the information she needed, while also giving her the comfort of knowing that Daniel had not been alone or uncared for at the end. He sent the letter, and then went and sat by Daniel's grave for a while, and talked to his brother in the way people talk to the dead, which is mostly talking to themselves, but serves a genuine purpose anyway. He told Daniel about the store and the delivery route and almanac, and the roof and Mrs. Hendricks and the Sunday church service, and he told Daniel about Ellen, and he thought that Daniel would have had something characteristically optimistic to say about all of it. In the second week of August, there was a social at the church hall, one of the regular summer events that Caldwell organized to provide the community with an occasion for gathering that did not involve a saloon. There was music, a fiddle player and someone on a small pump organ, and dancing on the swept board floor, and tables of food that the women of the congregation had contributed, and the general festive noise of a lot of people in an enclosed space choosing to be happy together. Oliver went, because Ellen had mentioned it in the practical way she mentioned things that she assumed he would have an opinion about, and he arrived to find her already there, wearing a dress he had not seen before in a deep green color that suited her coloring considerably, and talking to Reverend Holt and Mrs. Calloway near the food tables. She turned when he came through the door as though she had been listening for the sound of it, which gratified him enormously, and the small smile she gave him across the room was not the store smile or the professional smile but a different one, a private one, that he felt settle somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum. He crossed the room and she introduced him to Reverend Holt properly, and they talked for a while, and then the fiddle player launched into something lively and people began to move toward the dancing area, and Oliver looked at Ellen and said, "Do you dance?" And she said, "Adequately." "Do you?" And he said, "Adequately, probably," and she laughed, which was a sound he realized he had been waiting for quite specifically, a full and genuine laugh without any reservation in it. They danced. He was, in fact, approximately adequate. She was rather better than adequate, and she bore his occasional missteps with good humor and only stepped on him once, which he was fairly certain was deliberate. They danced 2 dances and then stood at the edge of the floor talking while the music continued, and he was aware of the warmth of her beside him and the green dress and the specific quality of the evening. "I have been thinking about what you said on the road back from the Hendricks place," Ellen said, in a slightly lower voice than the dancing had required, addressing the middle distance rather than directly at him in the way of someone approaching a subject carefully. "So have I," Oliver said. "I was married before," she said. "I think you know that, and I was not unhappy with Thomas. He was a decent man and I cared for him. But I was very young when we married and I did not know yet what I was looking for, or perhaps I had not yet become enough of myself to know what would suit that self." She paused. "I know more now." "What do you know now?" Oliver asked, not to push her but because the question felt genuinely invited. She looked at him then directly, with the full force of those dark and assessing eyes. "I know that I want someone who does not need me to be less than I am," she said. "I know that I want someone who is interested in the world and honest about themselves, and capable of being still when being still is what the situation requires." She paused again and a very small smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I know that I want someone who can fix a roof without being asked twice." Oliver looked at her for a moment and then he said, "Those are all things I can offer." "I know," she said. "That is rather the point." They did not kiss in the church hall. That would have been a great deal more public than either of them preferred. But when the social was winding down and people were collecting their dishes and saying their good nights, he walked her home across the quiet street in the warm August night, and at the door of the small house behind the store, she turned to face him in the lamplight that fell through the window, and he took her hand and held it for a moment, and she let him, and they looked at each other in the way of 2 people who have finally stopped being careful in the same direction. He kissed her then, simply and without dramatic excess, and she kissed him back with the same quality of directness she brought to everything, and it was the kind of kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like a confirmation of something that had been true for quite a while and was only now being formally acknowledged. "Good night, Oliver," she said. "Good night, Ellen," he said. He walked back to Mrs. Calloway's boarding house through the warm dark and went up to the east room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor and felt, for the first time since he had ridden into Caldwell in the spring, that the world was not arranged entirely against him. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of happiness that comes from something you have been patient about finally beginning to be itself. He and Ellen worked together through the days with the same practical efficiency as before, but there was something different in it now, a warmth and a deliberateness, a series of small moments where their hands would touch when passing something across the counter or their shoulders would be close together when they were both looking at the same page of the ledger, and these small things had the weight of larger ones because they were chosen. He took her riding one Sunday afternoon, borrowing a second horse from the livery, and they went east along the creek to where the cottonwood trees grew thick, and the water was clear and shallow over smooth stones, and they sat on the bank and ate the lunch she had packed and talked for hours about everything and nothing. About their childhoods and their beliefs and the state of the territory, and what they thought the country would look like in 20 years, and whether there was any truth in the reports about the silver strikes to the west. She told him about her mother, who had died of fever 3 years before Ellen came west, and her father, a school teacher in Ohio who was kind and impractical, and who had never quite understood why his daughter seemed to want to be in the middle of everything rather than on a reliable and recognizable path. She told him about learning to read balance sheets from Thomas, who for all his lack of imagination with business had at least taught her the mechanics of it before he was gone. She told him that she had been afraid in the first months after Thomas's death, that she had made an enormous mistake in staying, and that the fear had been a good teacher, because working through it had shown her what she was actually capable of. Oliver listened to all of this with the full and genuine attention that she offered him in return, and he thought that this was one of the most honest and satisfying conversations he had ever had in his life, which was not something he would have expected to be able to say about an afternoon by a creek with a woman he had known for a few months. He told her things in return that he had not said to many people. He told her about the way Daniel's death had knocked something loose in him that he was still working to understand, not just grief, but a kind of reckoning with the fact that he had been living his life as though there was always going to be more time to decide what he actually wanted from it. He told her that coming here had changed that. He told her that he thought the freight company and the rootless years had been preparation for something, and that he was beginning to believe he knew what that something was. She looked at him steadily when he said this, and the afternoon light came through the cottonwood leaves and moved across her face, and he thought she was the most interesting person he had ever sat beside, and also, separately and additionally, very beautiful in the particular way that has more to do with how a person inhabits their face than with the arrangement of its features. He wanted to ask her something. He was not yet ready to ask it. He was a careful man. But he was beginning to calculate the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be, and the distance was not as large as it might once have seemed. September came with the first of the cool winds, and the cattle drive slowing, and the pace of Caldwell shifting from the high summer energy to something more settled and preparatory, the town beginning to think about winter with the practical urgency of places that cannot afford to be caught unprepared. Oliver had by this point effectively made himself indispensable to Harper's dry goods. He had repaired the back door and the front window frame and 2 sections of shelving. He had reorganized the storage room in a way that Ellen, after 2 days of pointed skepticism, admitted was demonstrably more efficient. He had taken over the bookkeeping for the delivery route, not because he had been asked to, but because he had noticed it was taking her time she did not have, and he had an aptitude for numbers. He had also, gradually and quietly, begun to ask questions around town that were not about Daniel, but about the general future of the area. He spoke with the owner of the hardware store about the cost of building lots. He spoke with the land office, which had opened a branch in town 6 months earlier, about the availability of parcels to the east of the cattle trail where the land was good, and the price had not yet reflected what the railroad would eventually do to it. He was thinking. He was calculating. He was being, in short, the bull-headed and reliable person that Daniel had described, applied to the project of building something that could last. On a Thursday evening in late September, with the first genuine cold in the air and a fire going in the small stove in the back room of the store, Oliver sat across from Ellen after supper and said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want to say first that I am asking it because I have thought about it carefully, and I mean it seriously, and not because the evening happens to be particularly nice or because I have been drinking, which I have not." Ellen set down her coffee cup and looked at him with the particular expression that meant she was listening with everything she had. "All right," she said. "I want to stay here," he said. "Not at Mrs. Calloway's. Here, in Caldwell, building something. I have been looking at land east of town, and I think there is a good parcel that would support a small farm, and I think Harper's Dry Goods has the foundation for something considerably bigger if it had the backing to expand the supply operation. I have savings from the freight years, and I know how to work, and I know how to make decisions about practical things." He paused, looking at her steadily. "And I love you, Ellen. I have been working toward saying that plainly for some weeks, and that is the plain version of it. I love you, and I want to build a life here, and I want to do that building with you if you are willing, and I am asking you to marry me." The fire popped in the stove. Almanac shifted in the corner chair. The wind moved outside, pressing against the windows with the first authority of the coming fall. Ellen looked at him for a long moment, And in that moment, he could see things moving behind her eyes with the quick and honest intelligence that was one of the things he had come to love about her. The way she actually processed things rather than reacting to them. "You said you love me," she said. "I do. You have not said that before. I know. I wanted to say it in the same sentence as the question so that the question was clearly part of the love and not a separate practical arrangement." Something crossed her face that was softer than he had seen before, and then she said, "I love you too." I have known it for some time and been uncertain whether to say so first, which, considering that I am generally not a person who waits for others to speak, was an instructive experience. "You should have said it first," he said. "I would have gotten to the question faster." She laughed, and it was that same full and genuine laugh from the church hall, and he felt it the same way he had felt it then, settling warmly in the middle of him. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned it to hold his back, and they sat like that for a while in the warm and fire-lit room while the fall wind went about its business outside. An almanac, presumably satisfied with the outcome, put his head on his paws and went to sleep. They were married in November in the Methodist Church, with Reverend Holt officiating and Mrs. Calloway weeping in the front pew with the enthusiasm of a woman who considers herself personally responsible for the happiness of everyone who has ever slept in one of her rooms, and with most of Caldwell in attendance because a woman who owns the dry goods store marrying the man who arrived in the spring looking for his brother is the kind of story a community pays attention to. Ellen wore a dress that Mrs. Calloway and two other women from the congregation had helped her make, a deep ivory color with small buttons up the front and a collar that showed the line of her throat, and she walked down the aisle of the church with her chin up and her eyes directly on Oliver, and the expression on her face was not the careful public face or the professional face, but the private face, the one he had been earning glimpses of since August, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. Oliver stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, which he had ordered from the catalog 2 weeks earlier with Ellen's guidance on what actually constituted best. And when she reached him, he took her hand and they turned together to face Reverend Holt and the words that were about to make permanent what had already been true for some time. "Do you, Oliver Wallace, take this woman?" Reverend Holt began, and Oliver said "I do" before the sentence was fully finished, which made Ellen press her lips together against a smile, which made at least 4 people in the congregation produce small sounds of approval. They had supper at the church hall after, with the fiddle player who had been at the summer social, and a table of food that was excessive in the generous way of community celebrations. And people danced and told Oliver various stories about Ellen that were mostly flattering and occasionally instructive. And Ellen stood beside her husband, and was, by every available measure, happy. She was happy in the way she did most things, straightforwardly and with full commitment, without performing it for anyone's benefit. And Oliver watched her in the candle-lit hall talking and laughing with the people of her town, and he thought about Daniel, who had spent his last healthy weeks working in this woman's store and had known her kindness. And he felt something that was neither grief nor joy but both things at the same time, moving through him in the way of rivers that have been redirected rather than dammed. He went to the grave the next morning, alone in the early light, and knelt in the frost-stiff grass and told his brother everything. And then he stood up and set his hat on his head and walked back into town to where his wife was unlocking the front door of Harper's Dry Goods and Feed, because the store opened 6 days, a week regardless of what personal events had recently occurred. And Ellen Harper Wallace was not the kind of person who let sentiment override practicality when the two were in any kind of conflict. The winter was a working one. They had plans, and they pursued them with the combined energy of 2 capable people who have found each other and have a great deal to build. Oliver had purchased the parcel of land east of town, a good 40 acres of mostly flat and workable ground with creek access, and a small stand of timber, and he spent what hours he could in the pale winter light working on the foundation of a house. It was slow work in frozen ground and short days, and he was patient about it in the way he was patient about most things when he understood the destination. He also worked with Ellen on the expansion of the supply operation, which involved negotiations with a supplier in Wichita about volume pricing on staple goods, and the addition of a second delivery route that would serve homesteads to the south, the direction from which new families were arriving regularly as the territory opened. These negotiations were ones that Ellen largely led, with Oliver as what she described as a useful presence, which he understood to mean he made people take the discussions seriously without having to do anything aggressive. "You are intimidating without trying to be," she told him one evening when they were reviewing the correspondence from the Wichita supplier. "I'm not trying to be intimidating," he said. "That is what makes it effective," she said, and he considered this and decided it was not a complaint. The house was framed by the 1st of March and enclosed by April, a solid and well-made structure with 4 rooms and a proper kitchen, and a porch that faced east to catch the morning light, because Oliver had spent the winter in the east room at Mrs. Calloway's and knew what a good morning light was worth. Ellen had opinions about the kitchen, which he incorporated, and opinions about the garden space, which he laid out accordingly, and by the time they moved in on a clear April morning exactly 1 year after Oliver had first ridden into Caldwell, the house was the kind of place that felt like someone had thought carefully about what life inside it would actually look like. The store remained as well, because Ellen had worked too hard on it to leave it behind, and because it was the most profitable enterprise either of them had, and they were not sentimental about commerce. They hired a young man named Henry Prout, 17 years old with an honest face and an apparently infinite capacity for lifting heavy things, to help with the running of it while they managed the expanded delivery operation and the farm. Henry Prout was from a poor homesteading family south of town, one of the many families who had come west with hard work and hope in roughly equal measure, and found that the territory asked considerably more of both than advertised. Oliver paid him a fair wage, and Ellen taught him to read the account books, and Henry showed up every morning with the loyalty of someone who knows the difference between being used and being valued. There was a conversation Oliver had with Ellen on a warm evening in May of that second spring that he thought about for a long time afterward. They were sitting on the porch in the last light, with the farm fields green and new in front of them, and the sound of the creek somewhere to the east, and Ellen was reading a letter from her father in Ohio, the third she had received since the wedding, the correspondence between them having been reopened by the marriage in a way that the preceding years had closed it. "He wants to visit," she said, lowering the letter. "What do you want?" Oliver asked. She thought about it for a genuine moment rather than producing a reflexive answer. "I want him to see this," she said. "I want him to see what I have built here, what we have built." She looked at the fields and the house behind them and the last pale light on the prairie. "He thought I was making a mistake by staying when Thomas died. He sent me 3 letters asking me to come home. I never answered them." "Were you making a mistake by staying?" Oliver asked, not to dispute her father's judgment but because he wanted to know what she thought. "No," she said, without hesitation. "I was making a life." He reached across and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat that way as the light went out, and the stars began to appear, and the prairie made its nighttime sounds around them, and Oliver thought that this was the thing he had been riding toward without knowing it, not just the woman or the place, but this particular quality of evenness, of rightness, of being in exactly the situation that fits the shape of your life. Ellen's father, a thin and somewhat apologetic man named George Harper, arrived in early June on the stage from Wichita, and Oliver met him at the stage depot and shook his hand and said, "We are glad you have come," and he meant it, because Ellen had talked about her father with the complicated affection of someone who loves a person and also recognizes their limitations clearly, and Oliver thought that George Harper deserved the opportunity to see his daughter in her rightful context. What George Harper saw was a woman who owned a thriving business and had expanded it successfully, and had built a sound house on good land, and was clearly and unmistakably loved by the man she had married, and who moved through her world with the confidence and purpose of someone who has made every significant decision in her life based on her own honest judgment, rather than the expectations of people who could only imagine a smaller version of her. Oliver watched George Harper watching Ellen on the second day of the visit, and saw the older man's expression shift from the slightly anxious look of someone who has come prepared to worry into something that was simpler and better than that. Something like wonder. That evening on the porch, George Harper said to Oliver quietly and apparently entirely sincerely, "I was afraid for her when she stayed. I thought she was being stubborn." "She was," Oliver said. "She was absolutely being stubborn. She was correct, and she was stubborn about being correct." George Harper was quiet for a moment. "She gets that from her mother," he said, and Oliver heard in the past tense a grief older than Daniel's. "The kind you carry so long it becomes simply part of the weight of being you," and he nodded and said nothing, because that was what the moment required. The summer of 1879 brought heat and work, and the comfortable accumulation of ordinary days that are, in the aggregate, extraordinary. The farm produced well. The store expanded its customer base as new families continued to arrive in the territory and found Harper's reliable and fair. The second delivery route was operating smoothly, and Henry Prout had proven so capable that they had given him more responsibility than originally planned, and would need to think about hiring again before the year was out. Ellen was the kind of wife who did not require Oliver to be anything other than what he was, which was a relief he had not fully anticipated. She had her own domain, and he had his, and there were large areas of overlap where they worked together with the practical fluency of two people who have learned each other's rhythms. And in the spaces between work, there was the life they were making, and the life they were making was good. In August, she told him, in the early morning in the kitchen with the light coming in golden from the east window and the coffee just ready on the stove, that she thought she was expecting a baby, and she said it with the particular combination of joy and practicality that was so specifically her that it made his chest ache with affection. He stood up from the table and took her face in his hands and looked at her with everything he felt for her, and she put her hands over his and looked back at him with the full and open version of herself, the private face, the one he had been earning since August of the year before, and there was nothing either of them needed to say that was not already in that exchange. Oliver went to the grave again on that afternoon, and this time he knelt in the summer grass with the wild prairie flowers blooming around the cross that Ellen had ordered, and said, out loud and without self-consciousness, "You are going to be an uncle, Daniel." He stayed a while, and then he got up and walked back to the farm, and his wife and the life they were making from the material of everything that had happened to get them there. The baby came in the following April, a healthy boy, and they named him Daniel James Wallace after Oliver's brother and Ellen's grandfather, and he came into the world in the bedroom of the house on the 40 acres east of Caldwell, with Mrs. Calloway serving as midwife and Reverend Holt waiting in the parlor, and Henry Prout pacing in the yard, with the slightly shell-shocked expression of a young man who has not previously been close to the frontier medicine reality of childbirth. Oliver was there for all of it, because he was not a man who found it appropriate to be absent from important events, and when the baby finally arrived, red-faced and extremely loud on the subject of his own existence, Oliver held him with the careful and slightly overwhelmed expression of a man whose understanding of the scope of his own love has just been substantially revised upward. Ellen, exhausted and brilliant, looked at her husband holding her son and said, "He has your jaw. He has your stubbornness," Oliver said, because the baby was still loudly objecting to the general conditions of the world, and Ellen laughed the full laugh that Oliver had loved from the first time he heard it, and he thought that whatever Daniel could hear from wherever he was. He hoped it included this particular sound. Little Daniel grew in the way of children who are very much wanted, with the confident and curious energy of someone who has never had reason to doubt that the world is fundamentally interested in them. He was a sturdy boy with dark eyes like his mother and his father's stubbornness in equal measure, and by the time he was walking, he had opinions about everything and expressed them with the directness of both his parents, which made for an interesting household. The store continued to thrive. Oliver eventually bought out the neighboring parcel of land and expanded the farm to nearly 90 acres, which required more hands and more planning, but which they managed with the organized intelligence that had become the hallmark of everything they undertook together. Henry Prout married the schoolteacher's eldest daughter, and they built a house on the southern edge of the farm property, and Henry became less an employee and more a genuine partner in the operation. George Harper visited again the following summer, and this time he stayed 3 weeks, and he spent a great deal of that time sitting on the porch with baby Daniel in his lap or following Oliver around the fields with the air of a man who is learning, late but genuinely, how much larger the world can be than the one he imagined for his daughter. "You have given her a good life," he said to Oliver on his last evening, in the direct way Oliver had come to understand George Harper was capable of when he was not worrying. "She gave herself a good life," Oliver said. "I got to be part of it. That is a different thing." George Harper thought about this and then nodded slowly, and Oliver thought that this was the most accurate description he could offer because it was true, and he was a man who preferred accuracy to false modesty. On the evening after George Harper left on the stage back to Wichita, Ellen sat on the porch with the baby sleeping against her shoulder and Oliver beside her in the settling dark, and she said, "You are good with him." "With Daniel or with your father?" "Both," she said. "But I meant my father. He respects you. He is not always quick to respect men who are not exactly like him, but he respects you." "I respect him," Oliver said. "He raised you. He must have done something right." Ellen was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He taught me that the world is bigger than the map you start with. He just did not always have the courage to go off his own map." She paused. "I think seeing this helped him understand that going off the map is not the same as being lost." Oliver looked at her in the evening light. This woman who had faced down a drunk man in the street on the day he arrived and planted flowers on his brother's grave, and offered him a job when he was adrift and built a business in a cattle town while widowed and alone and young, and who had said yes to him across a fire-lit table in the back room of a dry goods store, and had been, every day since, entirely and completely herself. "I came here looking for Daniel," he said quietly, not for the first time in his life but in the particular way of things said when the full weight of them can finally be felt. "I know," she said. "I found him," he said, "in the worst way, and I found everything else." She reached across and took his hand without looking away from the last of the light on the fields, and he held it the way he had held it the first time in the church hall, with the full awareness of something that matters, and she pressed her fingers against his in answer. The night came in slowly over the prairie, the way it does in that part of the world, not suddenly but in gradual and generous increments, and the baby slept, and the farm was quiet, and somewhere north of them the lights of Caldwell were coming on one by one, and Oliver Wallace sat on his porch on his land with his wife and his son, and thought that whatever Daniel had meant when he wrote that last letter about finding a place to stop and build something, he thought he understood it now in a way that could not be put better than this, exactly this: the warm hand in his and the sleeping weight of new life, and the prairie going dark and quiet all around them. 2 years passed in the way of good years, not without difficulty. A dry summer threatened the corn, and they worked night and day to save what they could, and there was a fire in the store that destroyed part of the storage room before they got it out, and Oliver had a long and difficult month in the winter when his mother died back in Indiana, and he made the journey home alone and returned quieter than he had left, but without any of these difficulties breaking what had been built. They were too solidly in each other to be broken by things that came from outside, and the things that came from inside they addressed the way they addressed everything, directly and honestly, and without letting pride get in the way of what was true. Oliver came back from Indiana in March of 1882 with the last of his roots in that place settled and concluded, and he walked through the door of the farmhouse to find Ellen at the table with little Daniel, who was now 2, and talking with an amount of enthusiasm that suggested he intended to make a career of it. And she looked up at him with the expression she reserved for moments when she was feeling something strongly and not yet ready to name it. And he set down his bag and crossed to her, and held her for a long time in the warm kitchen, while Daniel made observations about the bag and the hat and the general situation with the earnest commentary of a child who believes every development deserves a verbal response. "You are home," Ellen said against his shoulder. "I am home," he agreed. That spring she told him about the second baby, and this time she told him in the evening on the porch in the same way she had told him about Daniel, simply and without preamble, with the coffee in her hands and the last light on the fields, and he responded the same way he had responded before, which was to stand up and take her face in his hands and look at her with everything he had. The second child was born in November, a girl this time, with Oliver's sandy hair and Ellen's dark eyes, and a combination of these two inheritances that made her look, from her first hour, like someone who had very specific plans. They named her Clara Marie, after Oliver's mother and Ellen's, and she arrived with rather less volume than her brother but considerably more determination of expression, which Ellen said was a better sign anyway. The family in the farmhouse east of Caldwell. The store on Front Street where Ellen spent 3 mornings a week. The delivery routes that Oliver ran with Henry Pruitt's help, and that had grown to 5 homesteads and showed no sign of stopping. The farm that fed them and produced surplus that fed others. The grave to the north of town with the prairie flowers that Ellen replanted every spring without fail, because Daniel Wallace had been kind and had been far from home at the end, and she did not intend to let that be forgotten. Oliver went to the grave one evening in the 2nd December after Clara was born, with the first snow on the ground and the sky that particular dark blue of a winter night in Kansas, and he crouched down and put his hand on the cross the way he had crouched down on the first day, and he said, "You should see the farm, Daniel. You should see your niece and nephew. You would love them." You would tell Daniel Jr. his optimism was the best thing about him, which it is, and he would not understand it as a compliment yet, but he will. He paused. "I am glad I came. I am glad every day that I came." He stood in the snow for a while, with the lights of Caldwell behind him and the dark prairie ahead, and then he turned and walked back through the town and down the familiar roads to the farm and the warm light in the windows and the life inside. Clara was on the rug by the fire with the concentrated expression she wore when she was examining something that interested her, which was currently a wooden block Oliver had made. Daniel Jr. was asleep on the settle under Ellen's old quilt, having apparently exhausted himself in the day's activities, which had been numerous. Ellen was at the table with the account book open and a cup of coffee going cold beside her, because she had been working long enough to forget to drink it. Oliver came in and shut the cold out and hung his coat and hat, and Ellen looked up and her face did the thing it did when she saw him after even a short absence, opened slightly in the way of something private and genuinely glad, and he crossed the room and kissed her forehead and picked up her coffee and handed it to her and said, "It is cold." "You have been to the cemetery," she said. Not a question, yes. She nodded and wrapped both hands around the cup and took a drink and went back to the account book, and he pulled a chair beside her and looked at the numbers with her, and they sat together in the fire-lit room with their children around them, and the snow beginning to come down outside, and whatever the territory had been before them and would be after, in this moment it was this, solid and warm and whole, and built from everything from loss and courage, and the willingness of two stubborn and honest people to look at each other clearly across a firelit table and say yes. The years that followed were the years of the territory becoming a state, of Caldwell growing and the cattle trade shifting, and the railroad changing everything the way the railroad always changed everything. And through all of it, the family on the 40, eventually 90, eventually 120 acres east of town was a fixed point, a place of reputation and reliability. A place where people stopped when they were passing through, because Ellen Harper Wallace's word was known to be as solid as the structure of her store, and Oliver Wallace's handshake was considered the most bankable agreement in the county. Their children grew with all the particular energy of children raised in a place that asks something of you daily and rewards you for answering. Daniel Jr. became, as predicted by the evidence of his early nature, an optimist with a practical streak that his father recognized and his mother had cultivated deliberately. Clara became, as also predicted, someone with extremely specific plans, which included going east to the women's normal school in Emporia and becoming a teacher, which she did, and coming back to the territory to teach in the school that the county had built 3 miles from the farm, which she also did, and marrying a young man from a family in Wellington who had the good sense to understand what he was getting when he was getting Clara Wallace, which in due course he did. There was an evening when Oliver and Ellen were sitting on the porch, an older version of the porch by then, with a second chair and a small table between them and a view across fields that had been worked and loved for 15 years, and Daniel Jr. was grown and helping run the operation, and Clara was teaching, and the house was quieter than it once was, and Oliver said, "Do you ever think about Ohio?" Ellen looked at him from under her hat brim. "Ohio," she repeated. "Where you might have gone back," he said, "after Thomas, the other path." She thought about it with the genuine consideration she brought to questions that deserved it. "Sometimes," she said. "I am very tired. I can almost imagine what it would have been like. Familiar and safe and small." She paused. "And then I look at this." She gestured at the fields, at the house, at the road where Henry Pruitt's grandchildren occasionally chased the chickens, and he followed the gesture and then looked at her, and she was looking at him with the private face, the full and open version of herself that he had been the primary recipient of for the better part of 15 years. "The right things were hard," she said. "The hard things were right. I would not trade the order of it." He reached across and took her hand, and she held it, and they sat in the late afternoon on the porch of the house they had built on the land he had bought in the territory he had ridden into on a May morning in 1878 looking for his brother. And he thought about all the distances, from Indiana to St. Louis to Caldwell to here, from the man he had been to the man he was, from the grief of that first week to this particular warm and easy afternoon, and he thought about Daniel, who had been the beginning of it, the first step of the chain of events that had brought him to this porch, and this woman and this life. He thought about the letter Daniel had written from Caldwell, the last letter, the one about having enough money to buy land, to put down roots, to build something that would last. Daniel had not got to do that. Oliver had done it for both of them in a way, built the thing on the ground where his brother had last walked, in the town where his brother had last been known and cared for, with the woman who had planted flowers on his grave and made sure he would not be forgotten. It was not a sad thought. It was the kind of thought that has worked its way through grief to the other side of it, where it rests in the company of gratitude rather than loss. Ellen squeezed his hand as though she had read the thought, which after this many years she was quite likely to have done. "He would have been proud of you," she said, because she had said it before in different forms, and she knew it was true, and she also knew it was still worth saying. "He would have been proud of you," Oliver said. "He thought very highly of you. He told me once," she said, "that the best thing about working for me was that I never pretended the work was not real. That I understood what everything cost and did not romanticize the difficulty." She smiled. "He said that was a rare thing." "He was right," Oliver said. She looked at him with the smile still at the corners of her mouth and the late afternoon light on her face, And she was not the young widow on Front Street facing down a drunk man anymore, although she still had every bit of that particular quality of unshakable steadiness. And she was not only the woman behind the counter of the dry goods store anymore, although that woman was still entirely present in her. And she was, as she had always been, entirely and exactly herself. And Oliver Wallace looked at her, and felt what he had felt since the first, and felt more fully now for all the years of compounding, the particular and irreplaceable feeling of having found the person whose presence makes the world make sense. "What are you thinking?" she asked, because he had been quiet and looking at her for long enough that she had noticed. "That I am glad I did not stay in St. Louis," he said. She laughed, the full laugh, the one he had been listening for and loving since the church hall on a summer evening long ago in the beautiful and difficult and real country of the Kansas Territory. "So am I," she said. The light moved across the fields and the evening birds began, and the farm settled into its nighttime sounds. And on the porch of the house that Oliver Wallace had built for the life he had not known he was riding toward, he and Ellen sat together with their hands interlaced, and the world around them in good order, and the territory went on and on toward the horizon, still being made, still being decided, exactly as he had always wanted.